Without a doubt, no other man throughout history could compare to the man that was Alexander the Great. Perhaps he was not the figure who marked the most of our history in the long term due to his short reign, but proportionally to the short time he lived, he is undoubtedly the man who managed the most to affect and influence the world in comparison to the short life he had, and that already makes him an exceptional being whose equal will probably never be born. The incredible feat of a young king of a small kingdom like Macedonia, having conquered in less than a decade the largest and most powerful empire in the history of humanity until that moment, is an achievement that absolutely no one except him could boast of. However, after those incredible feats that marked his legend, Alexander, little by little, began to change, to the point that his friends and closest people could not recognize the ambitious but wise and rational young man that he used to be, little by little moving away from the wise teachings of his teacher Aristotle to favor an attitude of arrogance and pride incomparable to anyone else, taking all the merits of his achievements and being completely convinced of being a true god, just as his mother Olympia always tried to convince him. And after a disastrous campaign in India where he almost died from a mortal wound and the mutiny of his soldiers who were tired of moving further and further away from their lands for more conquests as they wanted to retire rich and alive, Alexander locked himself in his own delusions of grandeur and frustrations for not achieving more, beginning to become even more unstable and dangerous than before for those around him, with the addition of having serious alcoholism issues at that point in his life. The consequence of his new degenerate lifestyle and his divine arrogance would reach a new limit when, after a heated conversation between him and his great friend Clytus, in an act of fury and uncontrolled rage, blinded by his pride and arrogance, he would kill Clytus, despite him having been one of his closest and most loyal friends all his life. Once he regained consciousness, Alexander was horrified by what he had just done, deeply devastated and hurt by the death of Clytus, an event that traumatized him deeply and that was entirely his responsibility. But in our story, instead of taking this terrible event as a tragic lesson that he had to learn to try to improve as a man and become more rational, humble, and free himself from the addictions that destroyed him like alcohol, Alexander would continue falling lower in his own abyss of darkness until eventually dying of illness, and also because of his completely degenerate lifestyle that undoubtedly left many consequences on his health, especially his addiction to alcohol, just 5 years after having killed his friend Clytus. And this would be the point of divergence of our alternate scenario, the moment that could have changed everything, and that could have answered the question we'll ask ourselves in today's video. What if Alexander the Great lived longer? That's the alternate timeline we are going to explore today. So how and when would the changes occur that would allow Alexander the Great to live longer and prosper even more with the immutable legacy he would leave behind with his empire and incredible conquests? Very simple. The turning point that I see as most feasible would be the moment in which an arrogant and drunken Alexander would kill his friend Clytus in a fit of uncontrolled rage. Not that this tragic event wouldn't happen in this story, on the contrary, Clytus has to continue dying at the hands of Alexander the Great for this alternate scenario to work. As I said previously, while in our reality, Alexander simply mourned Clytus's death, sinking deeper and deeper into his darkest demons and addictions, causing no change or lessons learned from that event, here, Alexander the Great, instead of allowing himself to sink further into the abyss, would make multiple decisions that would completely change the fate of his life, his empire, and the legacy he would leave behind. Alexander the Great would use Clytus's death as a reminder of the imperfect man he was, receiving a gigantic blow of humility and a return to the reality of the world and what truly mattered, his friends, his family, those who helped him get to where he was now. Because of this, Alexander would make a promise in memory of his friend Clytus. He would swear to himself and all those close to him that he would never again let himself be controlled by pride and delusions of grandeur, and that he would stop drinking unless it was absolutely necessary for reasons of religious ceremonies or celebrations, but never again for vice, reducing his daily alcohol consumption practically to nothing. Alexander would remember that despite the sayings of many people throughout his life, including his own mother, he was still not entirely a god, and certainly his behavior and reaction to vices was not worthy of the greatness and image he wanted to reflect, beginning to become more humble and rational, and thinking of himself less and less as a god, but as a simple, exceptional man who achieved great things with the help of all his friends and loved ones who supported him from the beginning. Although in private, Alexander had begun to mature and recover his rationality and wisdom of his youth before believing in himself as a god, in public life, Alexander the Great continued to maintain that grandiloquent image of a man ascended to divinity, being an extremely useful religious and political tool and absolutely necessary to impose strength, respect, and authority over all the peoples he now ruled over. Little by little, Alexander the Great's private circle would see with amazement and joy that he was slowly becoming a more accessible man, and that he was no longer the arrogant jerk with delusions of grandeur he had been before, having much more control over himself, his behavior, and reactions, a fact that would make him regain the appreciation, respect, and trust of his most loyal men. Another positive consequence of all these changes to his person is that thanks to having abandoned a degenerate and careless lifestyle regarding his health, such as alcohol abuse, Alexander the Great's health would have improved enormously, doubling his life expectancy in this alternate history, which means that in this timeline, Alexander the Great would live to the age of 66. A reasonable age by the standards of the time, and an age that would allow him to continue conquering more territories and also to consolidate the government of his empire and a viable succession system so that the empire would not be dependent solely on him and that the instant he died, everything would collapse. After having installed a competent and efficient administration in all the provinces or satrapies of his empire, and having recruited and trained a new army, young, motivated, and thirsty for glory and riches, in order to leave the veteran soldiers in peace and allow them to retire without creating further chaos or mutiny in his army, Alexander would resume his multiple objectives of conquest. And so, by the year 323 BCE, shortly after what in our history would have marked the end of Alexander the Great's life, he would begin a new campaign to conquer Arabia. Focusing primarily on the coasts, the interior of the peninsula would be extremely inhospitable and of little use to the administration and prestige of his empire, while the coasts would serve to connect all the trade routes existing at the time between east and west, leaving the interior of the peninsula as a mere client state for some nomadic tribes allied with the local administration of the area. Taking advantage of this strategic and privileged position in the area, Alexander the Great would also take advantage to greatly expand Egypt, conquering the kingdom of Kush and the area dominated by the populations of Ethiopia, gaining access to goods, spices, and other exotic and unique foods from the area, further enriching trade with the rest of his empire and the civilized world. These campaigns would have taken another 3 years to be completed. Alexander the Great, now over 36 years old, understood that he had to hurry if he wanted to avenge his failure in India, especially with the rise of the new Mauryan Empire, which was wreaking havoc and chaos on the farthest borders of his empire, a problem that could become too much over time if he just let it go. Now, with greater resources, new young men motivated to follow him to the ends of the known world, and with the experience and maturity that comes naturally after the glow of the youth ends, Alexander the Great would not waste a second of his time, and after his successful campaigns through Arabia and the east coast of Africa, he would launch a second campaign against India, this time determined to conquer those lands. Now, with a calmer, more rational and strategic mind, Alexander the Great could advance more efficiently and calmly through the lands of the Mauryan Empire, but even so, the exotic and unusual terrain for his men from the west would make that campaign a very tedious and extremely dangerous one for all his men and the life of Alexander himself. But even after a decade of continuous wars and a seemingly endless resistance from these Indian peoples, finally, at the cost of an enormous amount of human losses, Alexander the Great would have succeeded again. He would have conquered the Mauryan Empire, annexing that territory of northern India to his already absurdly vast empire. Still, the campaign was extremely grueling for Alexander the Great. With now being 46 years old, he has been able to notice progressively over the last decade how little by little his physical faculties began to diminish, how his legs could no longer keep up, how it was harder for him to endure long battles, how he recovered more slowly, how it took him longer to recover and heal from his wounds. Simply put, Alexander the Great was realizing that he was getting old. With this new realization that would give him another blow of humility, Alexander would appreciate even more how valuable his time was in this life and in this world, because despite the fact that he continued to publicly maintain that facade of a proud king who had become a god, deep down, and with age allowing him a certain maturity and introspection about himself, Alexander knew that he did not have much time left, and that he had to take advantage of the little steam he still had left to not leave anything to chance in his empire for when he will be gone. And one of those problems that he wouldn't leave to chance would be the potential commercial and maritime threat that the powerful Carthage could one day represent for his empire and descendants. Therefore, Alexander, knowing that his body would not hold up much longer in the extreme conditions of a military campaign, would waste no time and would launch his last great military campaign in which he would once again demonstrate his genius in the field. The war and conquest of Carthage and its commercial territories would be extremely difficult and expensive in resources and men, especially because most of the fleets of Alexander's empire were focused more on the far east of his empire than in the interior of the Mediterranean. But even so, the military and technological superiority of his empire, like the aura of terror and respect that this divine figure would impose on the multiple cities that he would conquer and loot, would be an element that eventually, after another decade of ravages throughout the Mediterranean, Carthage would finally fall, not having the prowess or military experience of the warriors that were Alexander the Great and his Macedonian generals. Alexander the Great would add most of Carthage's main territories to his empire, annexing the entire coast of North Africa, leaving the Berber peoples as client states of the empire, while in Hispania he would extend his dominion over the eastern coast of the peninsula, thus finally assimilating the Greek city-states of that area into his empire, one of his last objectives in his life as leader of that gigantic empire. But eventually, decades of constant battles and conquest would have worn down the body of Alexander the Great, who at the age of over 56 would realize that if he continued to expose himself to the harshness and dangers of a wildlife in order to continue expanding, he would end up dying in battle from illness or from pure exhaustion, finally deciding with the humility acquired over the years to retire from the field, and from there stay in his capital of Babylon to administer his empire and prepare his successor, one of the sons he would have had with one of the many women he had in his life, while he would entrust the rest of the minor conquests he wanted to complete to his most capable generals, to the new generations of soldiers who would have grown up under Alexander's reign. Some of the last minor conquests that Alexander would wish to accomplish would be to conquer and add all the Greek colonies around the Mediterranean and beyond to his empire, thus completing his father's initial goal of unifying all the Hellenistic peoples under one banner. This would lead at some point to confronting the young and expansionist Roman Republic, because if Alexander the Great wanted to conquer the Greek colonies located in southern Italy, he would be forced to also conquer, or at least destroy, that Roman Republic of which he had heard so many stories about in the last few years. At that time, the Roman Republic was engaged in a series of multiple expansionist campaigns throughout the center of the peninsula, fighting with the other Italic peoples of the area, especially the Samnites, whom they were already on the verge of defeating and completely conquering them. But the sudden arrival of Alexander the Great's powerful army in the south of the peninsula would mark a pause in their internal disputes and with other Italic peoples to stop the terrifying threat posed by the army of the legendary Alexander the Great that they had heard so much about. The war between the Macedonians and the Romans would be a short but very brutal and terrifying one for the most veteran soldiers of Alexander the Great's army, with the Romans showing an aggressiveness and fury in their combat style and military adaptation that had rarely been seen in other peoples, having an almost infinite capacity to adapt to all obstacles, and having a resignation that imposed the greatest of respects. But sadly, all that would not be enough to surpass the largest empire in the history of humanity. Simply put, the Romans at that time did not have all the resources and military power that they would later have to exploit their true potential, ending up being completely destroyed, and with the city of Rome razed due of the extreme resistance they gave to the Macedonians, with the Romans preferring to die patriotically until the last man was still standing rather than surrender to the invader, a great and fearsome adversary that the Macedonians would recognize their greatness and strength of spirit that they would come to respect, but also to fear, thinking that having ended that Republic of Latins was a good thing for the future of the empire of Alexander the Great. Following the brutal destruction of a great culture and empire that will never be in this alternate timeline, southern Italy would be completely annexed by Alexander the Great's empire, while the north would be granted to the Etruscans, who would become the most important regional power in the area, but technically being a client state loyal to Alexander the Great's empire, with the Etruscans ironically reconquering the area now inhabited only by the ruins of what was once Rome. After that, other minor conquests would be added to Alexander the Great's empire during his final years. Final years in which he'll implement all the necessary administrative reforms to ensure that his empire was no longer solely dependent on him. Having partially achieved acceptance of the fusion between the Hellenistic and Persian cultures, and having created a strong, organized government that was adaptable to any future situation. Also, Alexander would have partially managed to separate his person into two entities for the different peoples over which he reigned, one being the figure of Alexander the Great, the man, and the other, Alexander the Great, the god, creating a cult around his figure which would allow his ideals, objectives, and legacy to live on after his death, but also that other competent and strong leaders could reign over his empire after he had died. And finally, after a life that few men could brag of having experienced, Alexander the Great would one day die naturally in his bed, never waking up again, at the venerable and respectable age of 66 in the year 290 BCE. His son, Alexander IV, who in this timeline would not have been assassinated by Alexander the Great's corrupt generals after his death, and who would have been educated and prepared to be his father's worthy successor, learning everything his father knew, even participating with him in the last campaigns in which Alexander the Great would have traveled in person to lead his armies, with his son already having great experience as an administrative and military leader, being able to be his father's worthy successor. If Alexander IV proves to be even half as great as his father was, then the empire of the Diadochi would have the potential to last for centuries, becoming the most powerful, greatest, and influential civilization in the history of humanity. And who knows, inspired by the grandeur and surrealism of Alexander the Great's feats and conquests, the empire could, in this reality, after successive campaigns in southern India, finally annexing that continent completely, even contemplate the possibility of one day reaching and conquering the distant peoples who made up the different Chinese dynasties, who would one day become the only worthy rival in the world to Alexander the Great's empire. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.